may I say that I am personally delighted to have Jana Amin here. She is probably the youngest presenter in this. Yes, go ahead.
And that's why it's my pleasure to introduce you Jana Amin. So Jana Amin is from Milton Academy in the US, and she's here to present her paper entitled Princess Fawzia and the Duality of Egyptian Women. Now, when I have to confess, when I read it, I couldn't tell your age. So I know we're not supposed to spend much time on the introduction, but I just want to say that from your paper, you're a remarkable young woman with what looks like a very promising future in academia, if you want to go there. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you everyone for being here. I really appreciate it. And I'm excited to kind of get started and tell you all about my research on Princess Fawzia. So I'll start off by sharing my screen. Can everyone see that? Yep.
Yes, yes.
Perfect. So my research is about Princess Fawzia and the duality of Egyptian women. And I'll start off with a little bit of an introduction about who I am. So as Sana and Kamal kindly mentioned, my name is Jana Amin, and I'm a 17-year-old senior in high school at Milton Academy, which is a school just right outside of Boston, Massachusetts, here in the United States. And I am, I grew up in Egypt, and now, I'm an Egyptian Arab American, and I'm super passionate about the intersection of international relations, Middle Eastern studies, and gender studies. And I've been doing a lot of work advocating for changing the narrative around Muslim and Arab women, and also advocating for gender parity both in the Middle East and globally as well. And so I'm excited to talk a little bit about that work and how it intersects with my research on Princess Fawzia. Without further ado, let's kind of get into my research. And so my journey with Princess Fawzia really started sitting at a computer in my home here in Boston, Massachusetts, and looking actually at the Netflix series The Crown, which I don't know if any of you are familiar with, but follows the story of the British royal family. And it was interesting, as I kind of did research into their history, I came across this woman who looked very, very pretty. And, she was not called Madeline or Mary or any of the kind of, classic British names, but instead her name was Fawzia. And that really intrigued me just right off the bat. And as I learned more about her and learned that she was an Egyptian princess, I was shocked because I myself, as an Egyptian, had never heard about her. And I'd actually seldom heard about the period of Egyptian history when Egypt was ruled by a monarchy. And so I found this kind of dichotomy of the fact that I didn't know who she was and had no background in that history and the history of that time period at all, quite fascinating. And so that's kind of how I began my research. And my research ended up taking me around the world to various archives that I'll discuss today, and eventually to a conclusion that I think many of us, I'm sure here today, can resonate with. And so so I grew up in Egypt surrounded by a lot of Arab and Muslim women who I would describe as being driven, impassioned, and empowered. And so whether it was my aunts, my mother, my grandmother, or even kind of world leaders, so kind of on the right-hand corner down there, you have Dr. Rania al-Mashat, who is Egypt's Minister of International Cooperation and Development. And then, there were just so many global leaders who I really looked up to and found I resonated with. And yet when I moved to the US in the 5th grade, I found that a lot of my friends and teachers had this perception of Muslim women was that they were oppressed. And every time I kind of opened the news and heard a mention of a Muslim woman, it was that they were voiceless victims of oppression and had little to no agency. And it was kind of that dichotomy that also really compelled me to research the life of Princess Fawzia. And eventually I found that the dichotomy in her own life is actually not quite dissimilar from what I myself experienced. And so today I'll be talking a little bit about the history of the Egyptian monarchy, delving into Princess Fawzia's life, talking about how, her life is symbolic of so many other Egyptian women whose names I don't have time to cover and whose stories I cannot tell right now, but all of whom were really pushing for change at a time when most of us might not necessarily think of women being at the helm of, various decision-making tables in Egypt and across the Middle East. And then I'll also talk a little bit about kind of the difference between Princess Fawzia's coverage in international media as opposed to national media. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about how we kind of as people interested in the Arab world, as perhaps representatives of the Arab world, or even just citizens of the Arab world, can do lots to redefine the narrative around Arab and Muslim women, so that future generations can kind of look back and know that there is a legacy of strong and powerful women from the Middle East who come before them. And so, quick history of the Egyptian monarchy. So, as I'm sure many of you know, Princess Fawzia was sister to the last king of Egypt, King Farouk, and she had a number of sisters and just that one brother. And actually, once the Egyptian monarchy was later overthrown, she ended up being the only one of the immediate royal family who was allowed to stay in Egypt, as by then she had remarried to an Egyptian citizen. So, an overview of Princess Fawzia's life. So, she was born in 1921 and grew up in Alexandria for the most part, but then went back and forth between Cairo and Alexandria. And then she ended up moving to Iran and marrying the then Crown Prince of Iran, Mohammad Pahlavi. And that was in 1939. And a couple of years later, she gave birth to her daughter, Princess Shahnaz. And then actually in 1948, she ended up going back to Egypt and then getting a divorce from the then Shah. And so it's very interesting because, it was a very public divorce at the time, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And then she got remarried a couple of years later in 1949. And eventually in 1952, the entire, Egyptian monarchy were overthrown. And like I mentioned, she was allowed to stay in Egypt, and she actually lived in Cairo in Maadi until 2013, where she died the day before Sisi actually took power. And so it's interesting because she lived through, great swaths of Egyptian history, and in many ways saw the progression of Egypt right before her eyes. And so I think, Princess Fawzia's story is one that really can tell us a lot about women. And so through an analysis of the media coverage of her life, we can see, this strange conundrum or paradox. And so although women played a really important role in society, that role was not always at the forefront of international and at times national discourse. And so I'll be talking a little bit about where I did my research. So I was lucky enough to conduct research all around the world. And I think that really helped me get an accurate picture of Princess Fawzia's life, but also the media coverage surrounding her life, both in international and national media. And so kind of one of the interesting gold mines in terms of research that I was lucky to visit was Oxford University's Middle East Center archive at the St. Anthony's College. And so there they had a wedding album of Princess Fawzia's wedding to the then Crown Prince of Iran. And it was fascinating because flipping through these pages, you're not only seeing kind of the wedding itself, but you're also kind of seeing the way these two countries were courting as well. And so there was a lot of geopolitics there. So you could see how once in Cairo, Mohammad Pahlavi was taken on a tour of a lot of the cultural sites at the time, whether it was the Opera House, the museum, even the Cairo Zoo, which, has kind of deteriorated since then. And it's fascinating to see how these countries were really vying for power and influence at this time. And yet at the same time, they were kind of connecting in many ways through this one marriage. And then I got to visit the British National Archives at the Kew. And as you'll see, I found a lot of handwritten letters there that were kind of fascinating to read through. And yet, although I read a lot of letters and a lot of correspondence between British officials in Egypt and in the UK, few of them actually had any mention of women. And so oftentimes it was all kind of just about King Farouk in particular, talking about how he was had temper tantrums. They referred to him a couple of times as being a toddler who needed babysitting. And it was also very interesting to look at the mindset of colonialism at the time that not only excluded women, but also meant that Egyptians were on the most part, looked at as inferior. And a lot of the dialogue around them was that of inferiority. And then I kind of, in Egypt, got to visit a number of cultural places that were, existed at the same time of Princess Fawzia's early life, so in the 1920s and 30s. And I also visited the grave of Shah Pahlavi, which is in Egypt. And so it was just interesting to kind of see these different cultural monuments and, put myself in kind of the feel and the era. And then I got to visit the Cairo Library, which was also a very interesting experience. And so, unfortunately, while they have a lot of materials, it was very interesting kind of the way in which the materials were all organized. And so they were not alphabetized. There was, little way to find out if there was anything there. And I think that's kind of one lesson that I definitely learned from my research is how inaccessible at times, researching the Middle East and specifically women can be, especially to a young person like myself. So they actually had to sneak me into the library, which you'd think, isn't necessarily like something they should be doing on a regular basis. But I do think that it's important to share because at the same time, I think they obviously have a lot of information and resources that are really important. And then finally, I conducted a large portion of my research at the American University in Cairo's Rare Books and Special Collections Library. And it was there that I really got the bulk of my research on Princess Fawzia's media coverage in national media. And so through things like Al-Musawwir, Al-Hilal, that's when I kind of really saw how the media coverage in Egypt differed from that of the media coverage of, large news sites like the New York Times, the Washington Post, and a number of other like UK-based newspapers as well. And I think, through my journey with Princess Fawzia and by looking into and digging into these archives, especially those at the American University in Cairo, I found a lot about women and a lot of portrayals of women more generally outside of Princess Fawzia that I think many people, especially in the West, would find intriguing, if not surprising. And I think, a lot of these images aren't necessarily ones that we'd see in portions of the Middle East today, though I think it is important to point out too that, Al-Musawwir in particular, but also a lot of the other magazines that did kind of mention women and were targeted towards women at the time, targeted women of a certain class and kind of this elite group of women. And so not necessarily all women the same way we might see today. And so, as I kind of mentioned, in international media, the majority of the research I did was at the Middle East Center at Oxford University, the Q, as well as a number of like global publications. And so the British Pathé was a big one, and I'll be showing a quick video from their media coverage of Princess Fawzia in just a few moments, but also I found mention of her in the Times of India and a number of Chinese newspapers, et cetera. So it was clear that she had this international standing and that, international media was in many ways fascinated by her life. And then national media, Al-Ahram covered the work she was doing a number of times, Al-Musawwir, Al-Hilal, and so forth. And so I think the first kind of, event in Princess Fawzia's life where we can really see this dichotomy between or kind of just like look further into how international media portrayed her is her wedding to the then Crown Prince of Iran. And so I will just pull this up so you can all watch. Let me see.
A wedding without a bride, such is the custom in Egypt. So when the Iranian crown prince arrives for his wedding to the beautiful Egyptian princess Fawzia, he does not set eyes on her until after the marriage contract has been signed by the king of Egypt, her brother. Now they are together for the first time on their wedding day. A mighty procession representing the public services of Egypt is organized in honor of the royal wedding. And this is witnessed by the newlyweds to the great delight of the populace. Their beloved little princess has married her Prince Charming. So Cairo honors the occasion in fitting style.
So I think we can see through that video kind of a little bit of a perspective or window into the way the British in particular viewed the Egyptian royal family. And so while, the commentator says this is the first time they are seeing each other on their wedding day, implying as if there's something, inherently wrong in that. And I think that tone of sarcasm kind of continues throughout this video, but also throughout a lot of the information and the international media coverage that I read about Fawzia. And I think that speaks not only to the way in which women were portrayed at the time, but specifically women from the Middle East and Arab women and women who are Muslim. And it's specifically interesting because the Shah of Iran, for example, was just as educated as Princess Fawzia. They both had a number of private tutors at home. The Shah had gone to a school in Switzerland, and Princess Fawzia had also gone to a number of schools. And so they were both educated, and yet international media extensively focused on his education, but not hers. And so the entire narrative was that she was being married against her will, but he had chosen to kind of like enter this arrangement, when in reality, it seems, for both, this was a political marriage. It was a marriage to, unite Sunni and Shia countries. And it was also a marriage to unite these two superpowers at the time in the Middle East. And I think, this narrative that it was just him who was benefiting from, this arrangement was very misleading and is very misleading even today. And then even once she kind of, married the Shah of Iran and ended up becoming empress, the media was still incredibly dismissive. And so, one photographer in particular who was internationally renowned and had taken extensive photographs of the British royal family, Cecil Beaton, went to Iran to take, this photo shoot of Princess Fawzia and her husband and their, at the time, 2-year-old daughter, Princess Shahnaz. And those photographs ended up on the cover of Life magazine and had a whole 3-page feature inside Life magazine. And yet all of them used imagery and descriptions of Fawzia as being caged. So you can literally see the cage that she's supposed to be like leaning against in this photo. But there were many others where a dove would be flying away. And it was just constantly this narrative that she was sad and upset with this marriage. And then, he also referred to her with this humongous platform as being fair-skinned, a fair-skinned princess with sad eyes, which I think goes back to this idea that she was not a person, but reduced kind of to her physical features. And he never really, bothered to ask her what she wanted and how she wanted to be portrayed. So I think that's very, very interesting. And I think it's also important to recognize that at this time, she's not only representing Egyptians now and Egyptian women, but also Iranian and Iranian women. And I think the fact that, that's probably the closest one woman can get to representing large swaths of the Middle East. And yet this was how she was portrayed nevertheless. And then even, through her divorce, which again made international headlines, it was often portrayed that he was the one who wanted a divorce. Either because she didn't want more kids or because there was something wrong with her, when in reality, it actually seems that Princess Fawzia was the one who wanted a divorce, as she was very unhappy in Iran and missed much of her family in Egypt and thus returned. And I think, again, this dichotomy between the reality of what was going on and the international media coverage is quite clear. And yet, in national media, Princess Fawzia, for the most part, was an icon and a national icon, especially once she returned from Iran. And so we can see here on the cover of Al-Musawwir on the left-hand side, Princess Fawzia is dressed as a first nurse, and she's encouraging Egyptian women to go out to the front lines and become first nurses and engage in the war against Israel at the time, which I think is fascinating because she takes on this political galvanizer role. And then, even so, it's interesting because within that same issue, you find, lots of women who are joining the military in various ways, helping with this war effort. And many of them cite being inspired by Princess Fawzia in some way. And that's certainly implied throughout this issue and the next, where on the very next cover of Al-Musawwir, there's someone who is dressed as a first nurse. And it appears, that was intentional to show that perhaps Princess Fawzia's efforts as showing that, you know, a woman can be both feminine in many ways. You'll see she has like lots of makeup on, and yet at the same time, you know, she was helping push forward the country and playing this political role. And I think, you know, again, here, she and her sisters visited a number of military hospitals at the time. And they also used their platforms to, you know, help create different initiatives to advance women and children's rights across the country. So in particular, as head of Mubarak Muhammad Ali, or the Muhammad Ali Charity, she made it her goal to start a women and children clinic in each of Egypt's governorate. And while she didn't eventually reach that goal since the royal family was overthrown, she certainly made some headway, and I think impacted the lives of quite a number of children and women, whether or not she was, you know, quite behind all those efforts or a figure piece for, you know, the government or other women's rights organizers who are behind the scene is variably unknown. But I still think that it is important to recognize the role she did play as a public figure at this time. And, you know, even at this time, she found a way to advocate for women. And so along with her sisters and other women who are part of the royal family, you know, she attended this conference at the Women's Palace too.
5 minutes, Jana.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. And so I think, you know, an important question as we think about how the international media portrayed Princess Fawzia as opposed to how the national media portrayed her is, you know, what does Fawzia's life tell us about Egypt's women, and of course, Arab women and Middle Eastern women more generally. And I think it's important to recognize that Princess Fawzia was not the first, nor the last woman who played, you know, such a political role in Egypt and kind of faced this dichotomy of international media portraying them as something they were not necessarily. And so here I have a comparison of the 1919 revolution, which of course women played a huge part in organizing and kind of were the figure pieces of that revolution. And then of course in 2011 too, when we saw large populations of women take the streets and protest. And so I think in general, it's this recognition that international media doesn't always get it right, which then begs the question, you know, where does that leave us today? And so I think, so over here, I kind of have a number of pictures of the Princess Fawzia exhibition, which I helped curate in the June of 2019 and is currently still up. Although obviously due to COVID-19, there's been like many changes to the exhibition and the university's day-to-day lives. But the idea of this exhibit was to help play a role in sharing the story of Princess Fawzia and, you know, changing this narrative that women are only just starting to take control of their own narratives and play a political or socio-political role in Egypt in particular. And so this exhibit followed kind of the chronological development of her life, and then also showcased, you know, the differences between the international and national media portrayal. And then finally, I think, you know, I hope I can leave you all here today with the question of how do we redefine and take ownership of the narrative around Arab women. So over here, I have a picture of myself giving a TED Talk, which, you know, feel free to check out. That's about, you know, how we do just that. But I think a lot of it comes from being here at conferences like these and discussing and having these really important conversations about the future of, you know, the representation of women from the Middle East and women who are in the Middle East. And it's looking at how can you really amplify the voices of a lot of the female organizers who are currently doing a really great job of pushing forward women's rights, et cetera. And so with that, I want to say thank you to you all for being here, and thank you to this conference for having me. And of course, a special thank you to all the people who helped me with my research.
Thank you so much, Jana, for such an excellent presentation. I really enjoyed it, really. So many comments here in the chat box say that they agree with me, actually. They enjoyed your presentation. There is one question from Dr. Per. He's asking about the veil. He says that striking that almost all of these women, Fawzia and the others around her, are unveiled. And he's asking for an explanation.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it has a lot to do with kind of the role the monarchy played. And so in reality, the monarchy was not originally Egyptian. They were actually Albanian. You know, starting with Muhammad Ali. And then through that, I think they had a lot of cultural norms that were very different from much of the rest of the Egyptian populace. At that time, though, the veil was not as mainstream, especially within the middle and upper class Egyptian women, as it is even today. And I think that's also another kind of facet of it. But certainly none of the Egyptian women in the royal family veiled. And that was kind of the custom for most of the monarchy's time, and especially after the 1919 revolution, when a lot of women took off their veils.
Thank you for the answer. Any comments or questions for Jana?
Okay, I think I see now Dr. Zani, Stephen Zani.
Yeah, so wonderful presentation. I just have this question. One of the things that was so new to me was that I really hadn't, I had a totally different attitude about representations of women at the time, I mean, of Egyptians that came mostly just fictional, because there's a bunch of these modernist short stories, and two of them pop to mind. There's a Bram Stoker one, and there's a Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And when women, Egyptian women and men, get depicted, they're not infantilized. You'd sort of brought that, and they're not minimized really. They're even, it's somewhat xenophobic. They're sinister, you know. It's this kind of notion of external invasion and the like. And I wanted to. I mean, you could sort of see here that that's not at all what's going on in these media representations. And you know, so my immediate thoughts were, well, I mean, I guess it's an interesting difference between fiction versus the lives of real people, but maybe royalty, you know, maybe it's a class issue too. Anyway, I sort of wanted to know what you thought about that. You know, that there are these fictional accounts that aren't quite the same thing as what was going on, obviously, in the media and otherwise. And
yeah, thank you. That's a great point, and I think that's, you know, definitely something that, especially today, we see more and more of. You know, if you turn on the media, I think less than reducing Muslim women, oftentimes it is this narrative of terrorism, right? And I think that's something, obviously, that Muslims in particular, but also Arabs have struggled with. And then I think, you know, when we look at that time period, it's interesting you kind of bring up that some of these short stories refer to that time period, because I think it still was this kind of like double bind where they're both like reduced to be sometimes no more than like a dress or no more than a wedding. And at the same time, on the other hand, they can be reduced to being like these evil personas. And I think that was certainly what happened with a lot of the men at the time. So even reports of King Farouk showed him out to be nothing but evil. And I think in many ways that also feeds into, you know, this international media coverage that is negative and portrays these negative stereotypes of Arabs. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, great. Is there any other comments or questions very quickly? Because we have now to go to the other panel. Okay, so I just have one thing to say, and that is what a delightful piece of presentation with so many, for me, you know, as an Egyptian, I just, the part about being a volunteer, the Fawzia, the princess, being a volunteer, المتطوعة الأولى, the first volunteer to go to Palestine war, that was really new, and I found that fascinating, you know, that about Fawzia. The other thing, very quickly to say, and I think that all of our colleagues and friends would agree with me, it is very obvious to me that you don't have to be Egyptian to be wonderful, but it helps a lot. Helps a lot, tremendously. And in the case of Jana Amin, that was very clear to us, you know? So just always kind of think about this. Iraq is okay too.
Can I have one question just to Jana, please? Why in particular did you choose Princess Fawzia to show this distinction in how the media shows her and the reality, what was taking place in real life? Why in particular Fawzia? What made you choose her in particular?
Yeah, so here she was the first princess that I kind of like came across. She was actually the first member of the royal family that I really kind of like found myself digging into her story. And then from there, it actually turns out that she was kind of one of the most prominent figures, especially internationally. And so her sisters, because they were younger, came of age kind of later at a time when there was a lot more kind of like geopolitics that were going on. And then they were very quickly thereafter overthrown. And so it turns out that I kind of picked one of the right princesses, but I think there's also so many who came before her, like especially the preceding generation, were feared by many of the men in the royal family, but also by many of the men in Egypt more generally. And so I think, you know, delving into their lives and researching them in the future is definitely a possibility. I think would be really fascinating as well.
Do you think that women are feared in the Middle East because of their power? And that's why men they give the pretext of religion and they want to cover a woman up, whether in veil or niqab, to keep her in the dark, keep them out of danger.
I think it's
and a source of,
yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the veil, because I think that has become both politicized as a victim of oppression, both in like international media, but also kind of in national discourses across the Middle East. And I think you'd speak with many women who would tell you that no, it empowers them and that's totally their choice. But I think kind of, you know, setting aside the veil, I think you ask kind of like any child in the Middle East, and they probably will tell you that like their mother is the one that they are most scared of in many ways. And I think, you know, the mother and the matriarch in the family does play such a huge role. And I think, you know, often when we're hearing a lot of like religious reasons in particular, those are being manipulated by a lot of men to, you know, develop this narrative that Muslim women are oppressed, when in reality that's not the case, and that's not what Islam tells us.
Thank you very much for your
answer. I think there is something particularly, you know, strong about the little, you know, Egyptian girls. You know, when I had my child Amira, I don't know if Amira joins us. She's actually in Canada. It's not with me here. When she was, I think, about 4 years old, and I, you know, as a dad, you know, she was like sitting far away from me, and I motioned to her and say, "Come here, little girl." She stopped midway, put her hands on her hips, and she said, "I am not a little girl, I am a woman." So but she turned out to be really good, you know, and she's doing her, you know, graduate work now in Canada. She might actually join us later. Okay, we